This program is Introduction to Resident Finance, and we'll be looking at continuing care, retirement, financial considerations from a resident's perspective. A resident moves to a continuing care retirement community, which we familiarly call a CCRC, in quest for peace of mind and the assurance that the resident won't become a burden to family, friends, or society as age takes its inexorable toll. The core financial focus for the resident is an assurance that the community will endure to sustain them later as they grow infirm, and that the community will have the means to meet their needs as they arise. A secondary financial focus is that the cost of CCRC living be fairly and equitably determined, and that the organization provide high-quality care and services at the lowest feasible cost. Residents rely on the good faith and fair dealing of the provider when they decide to move to a CCRC. Entrance fees are an investment and should be considered in terms of the expected return on that investment. Many residents are forced to sell their homes that they own, to pay the entrance fees. It should be clear at the beginning that the payment of an entrance fee, except in a cooperative or condominium CCRC, does not provide an ownership interest in the community. The provider is the owner, and the entrance fees allow residents to enter into a relationship of tenancy with the provider. Entrance fees are a financial consideration paid for contracted and other undertakings promised by the provider to induce the resident to move in. Residents want assurance that the funds that they entrust to the providers will be there to meet the related commitments as needed. A common belief is that it's better to go to a nonprofit community rather than a for-profit community, and this deserves some consideration and deliberation. It's a common belief that nonprofits are mission-oriented while for-profits are greedy. But in truth, a for-profit will not exist unless it provides adequate value for its customers. For-profits are investor-funded, while nonprofits are donor-funded, and that's one principal difference between them. Tax exemption for the nonprofit is a second difference between for-profits and nonprofits. For-profits pay taxes, while nonprofits generally do not. Sometimes they do pay, in lieu of taxes, certain payments to help support the communities in which they thrive, but that is not always the case. Lenders view CCRC entrance fees as equity capital to be expended before lenders are impacted. In other words, from the debt holder's point of view, the CCRC entrance fees are at-risk capital to be used to protect the interests of the debt holders if the community encounters financial difficulties. It's possible that for-profit operators manage costs more adroitly than nonprofit, but this is not necessarily the case. Also, for-profit operators pay their full share of community expenses in taxes, while nonprofits are generally tax-exempt, although many argue that they provide social benefits to the community in lieu of taxes that are at least as great or greater than the taxes that the for-profits provide. Nonprofit charities are designed to do good. Nonprofit businesses are tax-favored because they serve a public purpose. A prospective resident contemplating moving to a CCRC has a number of concerns. There are the normal concerns. Is this a place where I would want to live, and how do I feel about moving into my final residence where I'll spend the rest of my life? But beyond those are a number of financial concerns. First is, can I afford to live here? That's a financial undertaking, and many providers require residents to provide evidence of good health and sufficient wealth at move-in to ensure that it's unlikely that they'll outlive their financial resources. But the resident needs to consider before move-in whether they can afford the undertakings involved in CCRC residence. A second question is whether the CCRC itself will remain financially secure throughout the resident's lifetime, allowing the resident to have an assurance of financial security for that period. Then there's the concern that there may be a danger that the resident's finances might run out, allowing the resident to outlive his financial resource, leaving the resident destitute or as a ward of the state. No one wants to be put into that predicament, and residents are rightly concerned about that before move-in. Although Revenue Ruling 72-124 requires that nonprofit homes for the aged keep residents in residency even if their resources run out, they may require them to first qualify for Medicaid or other assistance, which does give them the status of being a ward of the state, or they may deny the assistance if the argument is made that the resident has not managed his finances as skillfully as it would be desirable given the mutual commitments undertaken. Prospective residents also are concerned about whether they can know that the promises made to induce them to move in will be kept. For example, it may be indicated that the quality of the meals and the sumptuousness of the offerings will be at a certain level. How can the resident be assured that those promises will be kept, or is there the possibility that once the CCRC is full, that these services may be reduced or amenities less advantageous for the residents? And finally, there's the concern that the provider may later introduce separate charges for services previously included in the package price. The incorporation of the resident handbook into the contract gives the provider considerable latitude for unilateral changes in the contract of adhesion, which residents are required to accept as a precondition of move-in, so this becomes a legitimate concern. Thus, It's clear that entering a CCRC involves a relationship of trust in which the resident contracts to have the assurance of lifelong sustenance. The resident has to be willing to place complete trust in the provider organization before it makes sense to enter into the agreement. Merely because an organization is tax exempt as a nonprofit does not mean that it is necessarily more trustworthy than a for-profit organization. The integrity of the management group and the senior executives of the organization are an important consideration for a prospective resident in weighing entering into a lifelong relationship with a particular CCRC organization. Nonprofits generally are formed to advance a mission, while for-profits are formed to serve a customer need. Both nonprofits and for-profits depend on trust and reputation, and both can be judged by how well they serve those who trust them. This leads us to a number of conclusions. Entrance fees are an investment to ensure a promised lifestyle and care as needed. Caution is needed since entrance fee investments are generally subordinated to the interests of the debt holders. The integrity and service mentality of the provider management team are key to a successful CCRC living experience. Nonprofits may be better servants of the commonweal than for-profits, though that is not necessarily the case, and each continuing care retirement community must be evaluated on its own merits. Finally, moving into a CCRC involves a relationship of trust on the part of the residents for the good intentions and effective direction of the provider organization.